do test levels, just give me your name and your address one more time.
James H. Ellis, 22660 San Juan Road, Cupertino, California.
All right, we're ready to roll.
Okay. So today is December 28th, 2007, and we're here at the Fetterman household up in the Ellis apartment on the 3rd floor. The address here is 22660 San Juan Road, Cupertino, California, 95014. The name of the person being interviewed is James Henry Ellis Jr. His birth date is on December 19th, 1924, and he's being interviewed by Jim Fetterman, his son-in-law. Drew Fetterman is the cameraman and the technical person behind the whole operation, and he is James Ellis's grandson. We also have witnessing here Annalise Fetterman, and of course Georgia Ellis is in the background reading. We aren't working with any particular organization at this time, but we will cover whether or not we should send it in as part of the Library of Congress archive system, so we'll be discussing that after this process. Basically, the first question is what war and branch of service did you serve in?
I served in the Army during World War II.
And what was your rank?
Sergeant.
You could repeat the question when my rank was sergeant. Where did you serve?
I served in both the U.S. and in Europe.
What, let's see, were you drafted or did you enlist?
I was drafted soon after I became 18.
And where were you living at the time?
In Augusta, Georgia.
Okay. And why did you have any choice in the branch of service that you went into?
No, I had no choice.
Okay. Do you recall your first days of service? Or first days in the service, I should say?
More or less vaguely, I recall the physical exams, testing exams, and then being assigned to a camp for basic training.
So tell me more about the boot camp. Where was it, and how long were you there, and what was it like?
I was there. The training itself lasted about 13 weeks. And then I stayed in the camp after all the others left because I'd been appointed to attend the Army Specialized Training Program, which allowed certain service members to continue with their college education until the program was closed down to get more recruits for combat.
What was the process by which you were selected for that program?
I was actually never told specifically, but it seemed pretty evident that depending on the how high your scores were in the various testing that was done at the time you entered the service.
Tell me more, like, was the boot camp, there's movies about boot camps and running through the mud and being under live fire, testing out your skills, poking the bayonet and dummies and things like that. Can you tell me about your experience? Do you remember much about it in boot camp?
I remember parts of it. There was a lot of marching, hiking, with full packs, and we did some of the things you mentioned. bayonet training, rifle firing, all types of infantry weapons, qualifying in them. There was training in hand-to-hand combat. Basically, it was a lot of physical training and some specialized training. If you were in something like machine guns or mortars, then you received specialized instructions in those weapons.
Can you name some of the weapons you were trained on?
Well, the machine gun, the light machine gun, 30 caliber, and I was trained on the 60 millimeter mortar. I remember we had some contests with other mortar groups to see who could put the mortars up and start firing in the shortest length of time. I think our company ranked fairly high in that regard.
Great.
Can we pause for a second?
Sure.
Rolling camera.
Do you remember any of your boot camp instructors?
I remember 2 or 3 of them, but I really don't remember their names. I remember the platoon sergeant that I had, who was a part of the cadre, and a first lieutenant that taught, I remember he taught the hand-to-hand combat course, among other things, but that's what sticks in my memory.
So you said that you basically had 2 phases. So you were in the States for some time, and then you were shipped abroad. Can you tell me anything more about your assignment in the States?
Well, following basic training in the ASTP program, I attended the ASTP program in NC State. And it was a basic engineering course. And we completed about the first semester of a standard engineering type curriculum. And then ASTP around the country was shut down, and everyone was assigned to divisions, various divisions, and started additional training for combat before we went overseas.
I guess one thing we didn't cover, but we should probably cover, is when were you drafted and when did you start your basic training? About approximate month and year, if you have that.
It was about March of 1943 that I went to Camp Wheeler outside of Macon, Georgia.
Okay, great. And when you got your assignment overseas, how did that process occur? Where exactly did you depart from, and where did you arrive?
Well, after the ASTP program was disbanded, I ended up in a new division to be trained for combat, the 87th Infantry Division, which was in Fort Jackson, South Carolina, near Columbia, the capital. And I trained there for several months, from about April of 43 to September of 43. And that's when we went overseas, as a unit, as a division.
What port did you depart from?
It escapes my memory at this time.
That's fine. And
I can tell you what ship we went on.
what was the name of the ship?
It was the first Queen Elizabeth.
Oh, wow.
And almost the whole division was accommodated on that one ship. Those that weren't went on another ship, but the bulk of the division was on the Queen Elizabeth.
So tell me a little bit about that cruise. I'm sure it was not a luxury cruise.
Well, they were in a hurry to get where they were going. It took us about 1 week to get to Scotland, and that's where we disembarked and took a train down into the middle part of England. And we did further training there, but it was mostly hiking, keeping us in shape before we went over into France.
Can I ask a question? And when you answer Granddad, make sure you still keep talking to Dad. Don't look at the camera. But what kind of emotions and feelings were you having on that boat ride over? You know, because you knew you finished all your training, you were on your way, you knew you were about to, you know, serve in the war. What were you feeling as you were getting ready for combat?
Well, as we were crossing the Atlantic, I fortunately never really got completely seasick, but I got seasick enough that it sort of kept my mind on that rather than what I was headed into.
Was there a time when that reality hit? I mean, was it later on? You said it wasn't during the ship crossing. Was there any other time when the reality of going into combat really hit, and what was that like?
It was hit me when we made our first attack in the vicinity of Saarbrücken, Germany. During all the rest of the time prior to that, which amounted to, several months, from the time we left the States until we went into combat in December, I just never thought about what might be. It was when those first shells started landing that I realized it was going to be a tough war.
So it was quite like a month or two between the time that you landed in outside England. I guess you landed in France. You said you
landed at Le Havre, I think.
Le Havre.
Mm-hmm.
And so from Le Havre to that battle, what was the duration of time between those two?
It was about 2 months.
2 months. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
So you were experiencing. You were in a combat area, but you just weren't experiencing heavy combat.
That's correct. Yeah.
So what exactly was your assignment during when you arrived in France? In other words, what was your role?
My role and our responsibility was to direct the activities of a mortar squad. I had the rank of sergeant, and there were about 6 persons in a mortar squad, and there are 3 squads in a platoon. My responsibility was to see that they, when we had an assignment to fire, I had to see that they lined up the mortar as closely as possible in the direction of fire, and then give the orders to fire and the orders to change the direction. That's basically what I was doing.
So was that done through a radio command? You had a radio man in the outfit, and they signaled instructions through the radio, or how did you get your signals?
In various ways. People who were close enough to see where you were firing could call back and tell you whether you were on target or not. Or it could be radioed back to someone who had a radio. We did not carry radios in the squads, so it wasn't a set way to do it.
So were there any, obviously you did say you saw a lot of combat, correct?
Yes.
And did you have many casualties in your unit?
Quite a few. I recall the first day of combat, the first attack that we made. We were stopped pretty dead with a lot of fire from 88 artillery pieces.
Wow.
And one of my men in my squad was wounded with artillery fire. Fortunately, it was not fatal. And he did not return to the company, however. Those who were able to be treated and brought back to normal health did return to the company. The first casualty in my squad did not come back, so I have to assume that his wounds were bad enough that he either stayed in England or was shipped back to the U.S.
So can you tell me about a couple of your most memorable experiences over there?
Well, one was after the Bulge started by the Germans, our division was trucked back up into Luxembourg and Belgium, about 200 miles or so. And we were on the, well, I can't remember for sure the name of the river, but they had not been able to get any prisoners. We were in Luxembourg, staying in an old castle, sleeping on the floor. And they needed prisoners to get information about where the enemy may be and what strength. And they came around looking for volunteers through the battalion, and I was one of about 8 sergeants that was picked to make up this patrol, a night patrol, to cross the river and try to capture our prisoner. And the temperature was about 0, and we were able to ford the river by wading across. It came up, it was about to my armpits. Of course, I was one of the shorter ones in the group. And after we got out, our clothes just immediately froze. And we'd taken our shoes off to do that. And so the first thing we did was sit down, put our shoes on. And then we got up and started moving into the suburbs of a little town. And fortunately, we ran into a German patrol, and it was a 2-man patrol. We were able to capture one. The other one ran away in time that he got away. We didn't want to make too much noise. We didn't want to get ourselves captured. So we took our one prisoner and waded back across the river again. Getting back into that river the second time wasn't easy. But it felt mighty good when we got into a warm house and a change of clothes before we went back to the castle where we were staying. And we were sleeping on the floor. It wasn't like a Hyatt Regency.
So can you tell me about any, what was probably the most intense battle experience you had?
Well, there are quite a few of those because the mortar squads generally were in the rear of one of the platoons because our position would be firing over their heads. And as a result, we sustained a lot of artillery fire as we were moving, and especially if you were in the woods, in the forest, there were a lot of tree bursts of shells, and the fragments came down from the tops of the trees. And that's where most of the casualties came from, was artillery fire, shrapnel.
So it would blow a tree up and the tree fragments would just...
It wasn't the tree fragments, it was the fragments from the shell. From the shell. And I had other experiences. I remember once we were being fired on by artillery and mortars, and I was laying down as close to the ground as I could get, hoping the fragments would go over my head, and one of the artillery shells landed about 4 feet from me. It happened to be a dud. It just dug into the ground, but it didn't explode.
Wow.
I was quite fortunate that time. I was one of the few in the company that did not get a wound. How I missed it, I don't know, because I was certainly in a lot of small weapons and artillery fire over a period of several months. But luckily, the closest I can remember after one of these attacks, I had on a knapsack with my eating utensils in it. And when I took my pack off, the back part of it was just in shreds. So the shrapnel had just gone across my back, hitting my knapsack, but not touching me.
Wow. So you were in the Battle of the Bulge. What part did your platoon and company play in the Battle of the Bulge?
Well, our division, as I said previously, was trucked back up from Saarbrücken to Belgium, into Belgium. Well, Luxembourg first and then Belgium. And we actually sort of blunted a portion of the Bulge. We stopped the Germans in our area. We went on an attack as soon as we got up there, and were never pushed back, but we stopped our area of where the Germans had gone into Belgium. It was somewhere in the area below Bastogne is where we first went into battle during the Bulge.
Now, I remember you telling me that you never went camping after that. Could you tell me what you experienced during your combat experience where you don't ever want to go camping again?
Well, we spent most of the time 24 hours a day outside, sleeping on the ground, and most of my combat experience was in the winter, and they have some very cold winters in Europe, and especially the area we were in. And as a result, I just never had a desire to just sleep outside in a tent, even though most of the sleeping I did was not in a tent. It was just under the stars, or in a farmhouse, barn.
And did you were you ever a prisoner of war?
No, I was never captured.
Now, you did tell me you did come into Germany and saw one of the concentration camps. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yes, our division was in the area of Buchenwald, and I think the division commander wanted as many people as possible to see the atrocities firsthand that had been taking place. We happened to go into an area of the camp where there were Polish workers, Polish men who had been shipped into that area to do work for the German people. One spot that we captured was a a propeller factory underground. It was in a cave, and we were able to take a look at that. But the physical condition of these Polish workers was pretty bad. They just looked like skeletons. They could hardly move.
Did that change your perspective on the war that you were fighting?
I don't think so, because I think we already knew about a lot of the atrocities that had taken place. Although a lot more came out after the war than was known during the war.
How did you stay in touch with your family?
By V-mail. It was a little specially designed sheet of paper that you would write your letter, and then they would take that and photograph it and reduce the size from like an 8 by 10 sheet of paper down to a 5 by 6. You could tell from the texture of it that it was a photograph.
Do you have any of those letters?
Well, I did have, because my mother saved all of them that I sent her, and I think my wife saved a few. But in all the various moves we've made since that time, I'm not sure where those things may be.
How many letters did you send, and what kind of things did you write in your letters?
Well, you would write home usually when you had an opportunity to do that. There were times when you would go for a week or two and not be able to write home. And there was no need trying to write about your experiences, because everything you wrote was censored and it would just be cut out. So my main thing was just to let the folks at home know that I was all right and hadn't been hurt.
So you couldn't say anything about where you were or what you were doing? All you could say was that you were essentially okay?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Why did they censor mail?
So that the enemy couldn't get a lot of pieces like this from various letters and put it together and determine things like troop strength, where they may be located, where would be the best place to attack, things like that. Because I'm sure some of this mail was captured by the Germans.
Did you feel any particular pressure or stress?
Yes, I would say I felt a little stress at times. But after a while, you do get used to it in a way, But when the shells and the bullets start whizzing overhead, you still sort of tighten up your stomach. You know. But in all, it's a stressful affair. For some people, a few. There were very few, but there were a few who reached the point that they just couldn't take it anymore. I had one boy in my squad that had this happen to him. And it's not a easy thing to observe. He just sort of, went out of his head with fear, crying. So he was sent back for rehabilitation.
So what did you do when you were on leave? Did you have that much leave, and what did you do?
After I started combat, I didn't have any leave until immediately after the war was over. They did give leave to a few people occasionally. I just happened, my turn came right at the end of the war, and I got a week stay in the Riviera in Nice, France, which was very enjoyable after what I'd been through.
There, I take it you stayed in a hotel room.
I did. In fact, occasionally since then, I have seen that same hotel in movies and news articles, and recognized it as the place that I'd stayed.
Well, tell me about your feeling when the war was the VE Day occurred.
Well, we were all quite happy. Celebrated. It happened we had run across a cellar that had a lot of champagne. Actually, it was an underground storage place for champagne. And we celebrated with that. That was the first time I had wine of any kind. And I didn't have too much of that, but we enjoyed it nevertheless.
So what were the different places you traveled while during combat and so forth? You said you started out in France, and tell me about the different places you traveled. You said Luxembourg as well. Any other places in Europe that you ended up traveling? You said the Riviera. So it sounds like you saw quite a bit.
Well, France, we went all the way across France into the southern part of the Germany at Saarbrücken. I mentioned that before. And then when the Bulge started, we came up to Luxembourg and then into Belgium. And we went through numerous small towns. that I don't even remember the names of. We crossed the Mosel River in rubber boats. Our assignment was to get across the Mosel, which was located between the Rhine River and the Mosel River, and we had an engineer steering the rubber boat, and there was a lot of smoke screen so that hopefully we wouldn't be fired on. And at one point, as the smoke began to lift, we had ended up right back where we started. So much for that particular engineer. But he did finally get us across. And Koblenz was the largest city that we took during combat. And it was a large town. It was much, there were very few people, civilians, in the town. There were a number of Germans that were located in houses and created some sniper fire. But the worst part was as we entered the outskirts of Koblenz, we had to cross an airfield. And they had ACAC guns using for firing at any aircraft. And they lowered those to fire across the ground. And we had to wade through that. And again, I didn't get hit. But those things are like machine guns with shells that burst. And fortunately, we didn't have too many casualties in that operation, but a few. And then we moved on into the city itself.
Did you ever have to use that hand-to-hand combat training you had?
No, as a matter of fact, I didn't.
What's the closest that you ever got to the enemy? Like physically? Like, yeah.
Well, closer than we are together, yeah. We took some prisoners from time to time, and of course you had to get them back into the rear, and so you were close to a lot of Germans at that time.
What were the Germans like from what you could just see them when you were up close to them? Or what did you think of them?
Well, mostly, most of them were afraid that they would be killed, but we didn't kill prisoners. But at first you could see the fear in their faces, but once they recognized that all we were doing was sending them on back to somebody else to be interrogated and put in some form of camp.
of them speak English, and did you ever have a conversation with any of them?
Not anything more than trying to give them instructions, and we had no time for conversation. That was somebody else's job.
So how did you get back to the United States?
By boat. I think it was, the ship was the USS United States. That was the name of the ship, I think. And it was a more leisurely journey than the first one. It took probably closer to 2 weeks than the 1 week it took on the Queen Elizabeth.
So was your education supported by the GI Bill?
My education?
Yeah, when you got back.
Yes, it was.
And what did you do?
I decided to study engineering, and I enrolled at Georgia Tech in Atlanta, and studied textile engineering, and after finishing, of course there were a lot of jobs available at that point in time with the country turning back from warcraft manufacturing and into civilian manufacturing. So I had a number of job offers when I finished school, and I chose to go with a rubber company. And because the recruiting agent that interviewed me explained that textiles was one of the major raw materials used in rubber products, especially tires. And so my initial job at the company was designing and testing of textile materials to reinforce rubber products, such as tires and conveyor belting, things like that.
How did your service and experience over there in World War II affect your life?
That's hard to say. I probably have a greater appreciation of life today than I would have had otherwise. It was something that was just you had to do, and when it was over, you just felt good that it was over. I sort of tended to put those things out of my mind. So that's why this interview is so hard for you, because I don't remember a lot about it. But that's been over 60 years ago.
Is there anything that you would like to add that I haven't covered in this interview?
Well, when we came home from Europe, we were assigned to have a 30-day leave and then regroup and begin a short training for the Pacific. We were to be shipped over to the Pacific to get involved in that part of the war. And during my leave, the war in Japan ended because of the 2 atomic bombs that were dropped. And so when we were sent, when we had to go back to Fort Benning to regroup for this training. But when we got back to Fort Benning, they told us we were going to be separated. And so they sent each of us to the closest separation center to our hometowns. And I was sent to Augusta, which happened to be at Fort Gordon, which happened to be my hometown. And I worked at Fort Gordon assisting in the separation of soldiers until my number came up and I was separated myself.
How long did that process take?
Well, I had to wait about a month, I guess, before my number came up. And your number was based on how much service you had, whether you were in combat, probably wounded. If you were wounded, that you probably got extra points for that. And, but I spent all of my time at home. I had a bed assigned to me at the camp, but I only went out there once a week. They didn't need that many people to separate half a dozen people at a time. And so I stayed at home, except for one day a week I would go to work. That was the best assignment I had in the Army.
How shortly after you got out of the war did you get married?
Well, we got engaged during my leave, and at that time I was anticipating going to the Pacific, and we decided we would wait until I came back from the Pacific theater to get married. But then when we got to Fort Benning and I got sent back home, at least to a camp that was only 15 miles from home, we decided to go ahead and get married and not wait until I got out of the service, because I wasn't going to get out until January. And this was like the 1st of September. And I think it was a little burden on George's mother to plan a wedding with only about 2 months' time. But it all came about.
And when were you married?
November 21st, 1945.
Well, great. That was a very good interview. Thank you very much, and we'll conclude at this time.
Thank you.
Can we just get you saying what your rank and what your battalion, wasn't there a question there that says,
I think he said he was a sergeant, and he did. I think he
include
did.
It was, I was in the 345th
Yeah, probably.
Infantry Regiment of the 87th Infantry Division.
all right.
And then point to the different.
I probably don't even remember what it all is. Yeah.
How much did you weigh when you wore that uniform?
About 145 or 50.
That much?
It's all muscle.
Yeah. I didn't weigh that much when I went in.
Explain a little bit about your uniform.
And if you can maybe push it up a little bit because it's hard, a little bit of a rough angle there. Yeah, there you go. Oops.
Of course, this is just to indicate you in the infantry. This is my regimental insignia, the 345th. It's silver and blue, so that should be real shiny, but I haven't shined it for 60 years. And this is the combat infantry badge. I think this is just for being in the service. This is the European Theater ribbon with 3 stars that represent the 3 major battles that we were in, the unit was in. The Battle of the Bulge, the Ardennes, being one. The one of them is Central Europe. That would be near the end of the war. We had a task force where it was the only time that we were involved with using tanks as transportation in battle. And the entire division took turns, I guess probably a regiment at the time, of riding tanks. We would have about 7 or 8 soldiers hanging on to one tank as we would be going across country. And as we hit each village, we would sort of make sure that it was clear of Germans, or if not, capture them, send them back. And we did that for about a week and covered a pretty good bit of territory. And I think that was the area, the battle area called Central Europe. The other one, I don't remember right now. This, of course, is the insignia for the division, the Golden Acorn Division.
Is there another insignia underneath the
This?
lapel? Underneath that lapel, there's another. Looks like another.
Oh, that's the lame duck, ruptured duck. Ruptured duck. That means you have been discharged.
That's a very good one to have.
Yeah, that's the last one I got. And then I got married in this.
Oh, wow.
Because I was still in the service.
Great.
Okay.